Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso, and today we have another Watches and Movies video. Today we're going to be looking at the 1964 James Bond classic Goldfinger. Now this video is actually a viewer suggestion, so please do leave in the comments below what watches for movies you'd like to see in the future, or what movies you'd like to be featured that you don't know what watches in them, so that I can do those for future videos. But in any case, let's get right into it with Goldfinger, starting with the main character, James Bond, as portrayed by Sean Connery. Now close to the beginning of this movie, there's a scene where James Bond sneaks in and plants some explosives, and then he takes off his scuba suit, he's in a full tux, and then he checks his watch to make sure he knows what time the explosives are going to go off, and of course he illuminates it with his lighter, and we see that it is a Rolex Submariner. Specifically the reference 6538 Big Crown. Now this is one of the most iconic appearances of a watch in a movie, and it really does set the tone for watches in James Bond movie in the future, right up to the Omegas we currently see now. At 38mm, it was very contemporary of the time and not that small for today's times even, but it was actually exceptionally thick. The crown itself had an 8mm diameter, and that crown was actually made by a company called Brevet, and it added to the thickness of this watch, which ends up being 16mm. To put that into perspective, my Tudor is 15mm, and this already feels huge. So I can imagine this must have felt enormous on Bond's wrist. Add to that the fact that he had it on a NATO strap, which was clearly way too small for the watch. It was definitely an interesting style choice for Bond, to say the least. But regardless, it makes sense because, on its own at least, the Submariner in today's times is a very useful watch that can still be worn in more formal occasions, as its iconic status has made it much more accepted into the mainstream in terms of formality. On the inside we have a Rolex caliber 1030. This was supplied by Galore, which was Rolex's movement supplier at the time, and which in 2004 they actually bought it out so they could bring it fully in-house after years of having them as the exclusive supplier for Rolex movements. And it was actually quite advanced for the time. It was 5-position adjusted. It's important to remember that Rolex, from a very early point in its history, 1910 I think is when it got its first chronometer certificate, they've always been very focused on precision. So this was still a watch that could be very reliable to be accurate, especially in a time before quartz and before phones to check the time. So it makes sense that Bond would have been using this to time precisely when his bombs would be going off. And of course it made the watch iconic. While the watch had been featured in earlier James Bond films, including the first one, Dr. No, he ended up using a Submariner right up until License to Kill, which is at the end of the 80s, and was the last movie before James Bond did its deal with Omega to start featuring their watches. So it's been an icon, it's been part of the classic Bond look, albeit he switched to Seiko a few times and Breitling as well on one occasion, but he's always come back to Rolex until he met Omega. So it's an iconic watch, and that iconic status of course contributes to its value today. The price range for a 6538 ranges from about 50 to 100,000 US dollars, depending on quality, patina, originality, etc. And then you have examples that have things like the Tiffany dial on them. Those can go for upwards of $250,000. So it's a highly collectible watch, and a lot of that I think is down to its iconic status that it achieved by being featured in this movie so prominently. But let's say you don't have $50,000 to $100,000 to spend on a vintage watch, or you maybe just want to have this experience but without having to worry about the eccentricities that vintage watch ownership has. Well, thankfully Rolex never really stopped producing this watch. They kept evolving it and improving it. And that's right up until today, where we have the Rolex Submariner 114060. Now note, I said Rolex Submariner because most people refer to this as the Submariner No Date, but in terms of its official naming by Rolex, it is just the Rolex Submariner. The one that we all know that has the Cyclops eye on it is actually officially called the Submariner Date. But getting back to the No Date one, which is the direct descendant of this watch, it still retains all of the practicality, the 300-meter water resistance, and the tool watch aesthetic, but it's also a lot more versatile in the sense that it's actually improved in terms of its thickness. At only 12.5mm thick, it easily slips under a jacket cuff and will even slip under some shirt cuffs as well. So that's useful for when Mr. Bond is donning his tuxedo and doesn't want to look as counterculture as he would have perhaps back in the 60s when he donned a dive watch on a tiny NATO with a tux. And on top of that, it's an even more trustworthy watch in terms of accuracy, since then Rolex has come out with its superlative chronometer status, which attests to a -2/+2 accuracy. So while he could now check his phone to see what time his explosives are going off, he could at least rely on his watch to confirm it and be accurate as well within plus or minus 2 seconds. Add to that its superior shock resistance and its parachrome hairspring featured in this 3130 movement. He can also rely on it more to withstand some of the different forces that he might encounter. Needless to say, it'll hold up a lot better than the original while still being a classic look and a watch that he can still dive with. The Serichrome bezel still serves as a timer for his dive, and it will never scratch as well, and the triple out crown is even more effective than that 8mm diameter big crown that it would have had on his original watch in the 60s. So thankfully for James Bond at least, times have moved on, but he can still count on Rolex to supply him with a watch that gives him exactly what he wants, and a lot more at this time as well. Moving on to the other watch prominently featured in this movie and perhaps not mentioned as much, and that was Pussy Galore's Rolex GMT Master. Now it's a GMT Master, not a GMT Master 2. This movie was released in 1964, and Pussy Galore was wearing the original GMT watch designed for Pan Am pilots in 1955. This is a watch that definitely meets Pussy Galore's character. She's a pilot, and throughout this movie she flies from Switzerland to Kentucky, so she would have needed those 2 time zones to know what time it was in both areas, so you needed an instrument you could rely on to be accurate. But also the watch itself, it demonstrates a lot about her character. She's a very strong, independent woman who doesn't want to be treated as sort of a dainty Bond girl, which was the stereotype of the time, and in some cases throughout most of the movies of James Bond. So having this masculine 38mm watch, which would have been enormous for a woman's watch at the time, it may seem normal for us now, but for that time, watches for men were in the 36, 35mm range, so this watch would have seemed huge for her. But she wears it well, she wears it with confidence, and her occupation justifies it. And this was at a time where actual pilots would have actually been wearing a GMT watch because they needed it. On the inside we have another Eigler movement. This was the caliber 1066. It featured a roulette dial, so it actually alternated between black and red on the date, and also it had the hour hand fixed to the GMT hand. You couldn't move them independently like you can with the GMT Masters that were released later in Rolex's history. And last but not least, one of the big differentiating factors of this particular reference is that it had a Bakelite bezel. This was a feature of the original GMT Master that was only used for this generation because when they passed on to later generations they switched it to aluminum inserts as they were more reliable and more sturdy versus the Bakelite, which had a tendency to crack or fracture. Interestingly, this watch, while still being extremely iconic and being a first for Rolex, it doesn't actually sell for as crazy pricing as the Submariner of the time did. This watch currently sells used between $20,000 to $50,000 US for most normal models, upwards of $100,000 when you're talking about ones with special dials and unique characteristics, and a lot of that is of course dependent on condition. But the 6542 in general is easier to find and cheaper to find as well when you compare it to some of its more desirable Submariner models. There's no real indication as to why, however, if you look at the charts of it, it definitely has been increasing steadily over the years. And that's probably down to the fact that the current GMTs also have a really high demand as well. Speaking of the current GMTs, you would think that the modern successor would be the current Rolex GMT Master 2, the 126710 BLRO, but I would actually argue that Rolex has evolved the GMT Master 2 into much more of a luxury fashion accessory. Obviously still very competent, but not necessarily the all-out tool that it was back in the 50s and 60s when the 6542 was in production. So I would actually argue that the true modern equivalent to this watch would be the Tudor Black Bay GMT. Now you could probably say the same thing about the sub and say, oh, the Black Bay 58 is probably more appropriate as a modern equivalent, but whereas the sub still maintains its status, it's still a luxury piece, but it still maintains its identity. With the new Jubilee bracelet, with the different coloration and the current way the market perceives the current GMTs, I would argue that the Black Bay GMT is more appropriate. On top of that, its design is a clear homage to this original design from the 50s and 60s, so I feel it just is a much more direct equivalent. The watch itself even maintains similar dimensions. Yes, it's grown, it's now 41mm instead of 38, and it's 1mm thicker as well because, well, Black Bays, they're thick. But it still maintains the same design spirit. On the inside you now have a manufacture movement with 70 hours power reserve, so plenty of reserve for if you're flying on a very long flight, crossing multiple time zones. The coloration of the bezel is very similar to the tones that you would find on that Bakelite bezel, because those even varied when you had the aluminum GMT Master 2 Pepsis as well. And last but not least, it's actually a lot more accessible. So overall, it's a really competent modern reinterpretation of that classic 1950s GMT Master, and still maintains the spirit of it, while still having the advantage of having a proper dual time with independent hour hand from the dual time, so you can actually change the time zones much more effectively and even read up to 3 time zones. Let me know what you think of both the originals of these watches as well as their modern counterparts. Let me know what you think, that if they remade Goldfinger today, what would Bond be wearing and what would Pussy Galore be wearing? And last but not least, let me know in the comments below what other watches from movies you'd like to see in the future so I can make videos about them. I might not always be able to make them right away, but I do read all of the comments and all your suggestions and take them into consideration as I'm planning my next video. So please do participate, like and share it as well. And if you like the content on this channel and want to see new watch videos every week, make sure that you subscribe as well. But in any case, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.